What are the Israelis doing to the Palestinians right now, right? They're doing what they want. And even though there's a massive outcry, a demand worldwide that they stop this genocide, what are they doing? No, they're making plans for escalating, right? And they ignore it completely, right? So it doesn't work if one country believes it's special or even, chosen in the eyes of the creator, like in this case. It just will never work. It'll never work if there's that idea out there. If there is this idea that there's a chosen group of people, okay? And in this case, you mentioned the chosen group of people in the EU, and that's headed by Ursula von der Leyen. But these people are not the people that are necessarily the ones that are able to make sound decisions, because they belong, as we've seen, to this intellectual group that are out of touch with what people are really wanting to do, right?
Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers, it's Jean Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in to another inspired conversation. This guest does not need a long introduction. You all know him. He's been with us many, many times. And we just said it feels like an eternity. It's been 2-3 months since we last spoke. And it's high time to bring him back. The one and only, the man, the myth, the legend, Frank Jacob. Thank you so much for joining us again today.
John, how you doing? Good to be back. Does seem like an eternity for sure. It's only been 8 weeks or so, but it feels like 8 centuries.
Well, that's because the beginning of 2024 has been so crazy and there's so much happening that, Jesus, remember when stuff like this used to happen in 20 years? It's like...
No, it's absolutely nuts. It's absolutely nuts what's going on, and I think that it's like it's gotten out of our control almost to the point where we just have to roll with it. And who knows? Every day brings a new surprise.
A plethora of them. But I think, we didn't exaggerate, Frank, you and I, when we said there's so much coming down the pipeline and there's going to be such huge shifts and transformations that, if people are not somewhat prepared spiritually, physically, mentally, it's just going to be too overwhelming. And we're going to dive into some deeper subjects today that we both think are highly important. So let's get right to it. What do you have for us, man?
Well, I was watching an interview with Yuval Noah Harari beginning of this year, and I was just sort of...
I'm sorry about that. Sorry you had to watch.
Yeah. Normally I would never do that to myself, right? But it was produced nicely, and I was listening, and I decided, okay, let's just give them a couple of minutes. And, because the thing is, sometimes you have to be willing to kind of look at the other side to understand where they're coming from. And not only that, but at the same time, if so much value and worth and whatever, pedestalness has been put on a single person, and you would say that Yuval Harari fits that bill in terms of being somebody who's like the prophet for the WEF and all of the leading thinkers out there. Well, maybe it's good to kind of get into their argument to see if you can hack it, because I think one person who's been famous for that saying that humans are hackable animals would be he. So I figure, why not dive into some of his arguments and hack into them and just show the people out there that are invested, maybe even to a point, in that philosophy that he's pitching, the weaknesses of that argument. And, always to kind of with the perspective of raising consciousness and looking at it in terms of, we're spiritual beings living inside of human bodies, right?
Frank, what I do appreciate about Yuval Noah Harari is, unlike many others, he doesn't sugarcoat things, and he has a hard time hiding his self-hatred, probably, and the hatred for mankind. So in that, you see a lot of openness. The Ray Kurzweils, and they're crazy too, but they kind of hide it behind a nice facade, and he's just like, everyone is hackable, and free will doesn't matter, and God, and nothing matters. So
exactly,
I think he's a good specimen to examine what the true agenda there is.
Absolutely. So I'd like to kind of break down 3 primary topics of interest that interest me and that I think he's known for. And one of them is his scientific perspective. And the other is his idea of liberalism or globalism, his mindset. And the other is ultimately AI, of course, that's a big topic these days. And I wanted to cover those three basic topics, right? One of them is the science perspective that he has. The second is the liberal globalist mindset that he pitches. And the third is, of course, AI and the coming end of humanity as we know it, which are kind of the three most popular topics that he's known for and that he's out there and that he puts into his books. So are you in? Are you in for it?
I'm absolutely in. Please shoot. There's always a love-hate thing that I have going. I love hearing because I need to know, but I also hate hearing him speak in many ways. So please shoot, my friend.
Okay, well, listen, let me just let's all good hacks, right? Let's just start with the man, right? So I'll put it up on the screen, right? We can put this up on the screen. And essentially, we're talking about some basic things that people don't know who Yuval Harari is, right? So you should know that essentially he's an Israeli author. He's a public intellectual. He's a historian. And he's professor in the Department of History at the Hebrew University at Jerusalem. So he's the author of popular science bestsellers. We already talked about them. The ones he's most known for, I think the three is Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. So all of his writings are kind of about consciousness and free will and intelligence and happiness. And, physically, he's a bit kind of gnomish looking, you'd say, with kind of short guy with pointed ears. Actually, he looks a little bit like, I was thinking that, talking to Tanya about that the other day, looks a little bit like Golem, right? Remember that, precious, right? So, I mean,
you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
You can kind of I happen to have a picture of Golem hanging around, so it's that is kind of funny. But anyway, I don't want to insult Golem, so let's move forward. So anyway, more information about him, right? He and his husband, Itzhak Yahev, and yes, of course, he's gay. You should know that. If you're hacking a guy, you should know everything about him. They're the founders of something called Sapienship, right? And try to keep a straight face, John. Come on. So Sapienship, right? It's a multidisciplinary organization advocating for global responsibility, right? So these are the typical buzzwords of these kinds of guys, these kinds of companies and these kinds of approaches to business that are part of that World Economic Forum circle, right? So you should know that, to know what kind of guy he is and where his priorities are. He's got a big heart because during the COVID-19 pandemic, following, former United States President Donald Trump's cutting of the World Health Organization's funding, he graciously announced that he and his husband would donate $1 million to the World Health Organization through Sapienship, right? This is their social impact company, right? So, the guy has
wonderful.
A big heart.
Just wonderful, yeah.
It's wonderful, right? We all know that the World Health Organization has our best interests at heart.
And nothing but that.
They love humanity, and it's all about health and improving society, right?
Yes,
and
indeed.
Here's a sort of a strange angle about him, right? That most people probably don't know, but he practices something called Vipassana meditation, or Vipassana, depending on how you pronounce it. And I don't know if you know what that is, John, but I know a little bit about it.
Yes.
So that isn't easy to do. So I was a little surprised because Vipassana meditation requires that you isolate yourself for weeks at a time, and you don't talk to anybody. You don't, you're just in a space of observing your thoughts and observing what comes up and stuff. So it's very, very powerful. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that, because if a guy on that side, that deep into the deep state kind of vibe, is practicing that high level of meditation, what does that say? In a way, it says to me that even if you're practicing yoga on a very high level, it doesn't necessarily mean that whatever you're going to pull out of those observations is going to move you to an enlightened state of consciousness. It could very well mean that it'll do is it'll just make you frame what your realizations are within your preconceived idea of how the universe runs. So that was something that I found very interesting. But what makes him, I think, the most dangerous of all is that he influences so many high-level people in the world, right? So I got a quote here from Current Affairs, a 2022 article called The Dangerous Populist Science of Yuval Noah Harari. And I'll put it up on the screen so we can read it together. But basically, it's saying Harari's flock are some of the most powerful people in the world. And they come to him much like the ancient kings to their oracles. Mark Zuckerberg asked Harari if humanity is becoming more unified or fragmented by technology. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, no less, asked him if doctors will depend on universal basic income in the future. The CEO of Axel Springer, one of the largest publishing houses in Europe, asked Harari what publishers should do to succeed in the digital world. And even an interviewer with UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, asked him what effect COVID would have on international scientific cooperation, right? So each of these people subverted their own authority in favor of Harari's half-formed edicts, he says. And they did it not for an expert in any one of their field, but for a historian who in many ways is a fraud, most of all about science. So I thought that was
I got to ask you something, Frank.
Yes.
He sort of appeared. I know that he was known in circles before the COVID era, but he really appeared during the COVID era in the public awareness realm. I know there were others praising him before he had written those books, but what do you think is his appeal, or what is his background that he's so revered, if you will?
Well, I mean, the thing is, you never really know where these guys come from. Usually a guy like Harari, to go from zero to, hero.
Villain. Let's
hero for the other side, man. He has to have someone who made him. And I guess, the first suspects, of course, are people like Klaus Schwab. Because, look, the guy he's sold apparently over 25 million books. Okay, that's no small feat. We all know that, to sell a lot of books means that the mainstream has to be happy with that material. Otherwise, we all know what happens to material that doesn't fit into the mainstream narrative. It just vanishes, or it gets dropped or dumped or whatever. But I think the other reason he's so popular is because he's what they call a science populist. The science populists, those are guys that are gifted storytellers, right? They weave sensationalist yarns around scientific facts, and they put it in simple, emotionally charged language. And so basically they scrub all of what they say into a vibe that has no doubt. So it gives them this kind of false sense of authority when they're talking. And it makes their messages, unfortunately, even more convincing, what they're talking about, right? So just like their so-called populist political counterparts, right? These guys are sources of scientific misinformation. So they promote false things, false crises, and they present themselves as someone who has the answer. And, there's a lot of that, as we know, going on in the world. So just think of that while you're listening to him doing his delivery, right? Because remember, all deceptions, they have to contain elements of truth in order for them to hook undiscerning audience members into their delusions, right? And manipulations, right? So that they basically make their pieces of information seem relevant. And, they're really, I think the most obvious way to describe it is to put a little bit of truth sandwiched, in between some lies, right? So it gives them credibility, right?
Absolutely.
Right?
Unbelievably so, but yes.
Exactly. So the interview that I want to start with is from another mainstream guy. This guy also shot up out of nowhere. I'll put him up on the screen. His name is Stephen Bassett.
Mm-hmm.
And he did this interview with Stephen Bassett in his studio. And Stephen Bassett runs a blog called Diary of a CEO. And he's become like a blogger millionaire, has millions and millions of followers, and is considered like one of the most influential bloggers out there. And of course, the so-called normies out there striving to be successful WEF members and future young global leaders, they're going to go to a guy like this and his blog to learn and, to sort of get what's important and what the trends are. And, anybody who's materially successful is, they're going to be looking up to him, because materialism is all what this is all about. Like that timeline that we've been talking about with timelines, the materialistic timeline, it's all about material success, monetary success, right? And by the way, Stephen Bassett's not to be confused with the other Stephen Bassett that I personally know, Antonio, who's the sort of the starter, the godfather of the disclosure movement, or is deeply involved in the disclosure movement, just in case you're wondering.
I really wasn't, but some people might be. So it's a good distinction.
I thought it was worth mentioning, right? Anyway, so the interview. So let's start off. The interview starts off with Stephen Bassett asking Harari why he does what he does. Okay, so I'm going to switch it on. Here we go.
Yuval, I have 3 of your books here, and these are 3 books that sent a huge tidal wave, a ripple through society. With these books and with all of the work that you're doing now, with the lectures you give, the interviews you give, what is your mission? What is the sort of, if I was to be able to summarize what your collective mission is with your work, what is that?
It's to clarify and to focus the public conversation, the global conversation, to help people focus on the most important challenges that are facing humankind, and also to bring at least a little bit of clarity to the collective and to the individual mind.
Right. So there, we know where he's coming from. He's trying to bring clarity, right, in a world of absolute chaos, right, and to focus the minds of his audience, which are, again, the normie types, the ones who buy. This guy, Stephen is obviously a huge, clearly smitten fan of his. Right. And in the interview later, of course, he's drooling all over him, trying to get him to give him an interview, etc. An autograph for his books. So, he's a big fan. And both of them are kind of like at it, trying to focus people's minds. Right. So he's feigning concern for the world. Right. Which is, I think, what makes him kind of appealing. Right. He seems to sound like he has some kind of serious concern. And he comes across more or less to that crowd as sympathetic. And he leans into that emotion for sure, right? And which in itself is actually kind of impressive, So, the fact that he's on this stage, he's sold this many books, and everyone's sort of, putting him up on this pedestal. He's gotten himself into a position where what he's doing is kind of a little bit of like a human or analog version of something we also discussed in one of our earlier talks called Operation Jigsaw. Remember? So you have like Jigsaw is an artificial intelligence way of intervening. And when you are pursuing information or researching on the internet, you'll get pop-ups that will warn you that you're about to enter material which is not authorized, right? So it helps to direct you toward a website or information which clarifies for you what the truth is, right? Brings clarity. So it's interesting. The language is very, very parallel here. And, so I think it really appeals a lot to people who consider themselves to be intellectuals because they're dealing with science, which is science on a populist level. So it's been condensed and homogenized for them so that everybody can understand it. And this is the dangerous part. And I'll tell you why. Go ahead.
No, I'm just, I've yet to meet a person that actually doesn't say to me, this guy gives me the creeps. And this is why I'm so surprised at, all the hype that's around him. 25. No, I'm not surprised about 25 million copies sold because I think a lot of the content in his books is actually identifying the projected or wanted future correctly. It's not about that. He's actually saying this is what they want. This is where this is supposed to go. That I get. But just the hype around him, because to me, it's just, I get all the warning signals around this guy. And when I saw Russell Brand kiss him, and I was just like, dude, you just lost me there, Russell. I don't get it.
Well, he's the small guy, and he comes across as relatively mild-mannered to more or less to agree. Sounds very smart. And like I said, he appeals to these intellectuals. And there's something we should know about that if we're hacking into somebody and we're trying to hack into their philosophy, I found a very, very interesting quote here that I'm going to put up on the screen as well. It's about a guy called William von Hippel, right? He's a evolutionary psychologist. And this guy, Vincent Ebert, dropped this post up on his Facebook. And I want to read you a couple of things about it because I think it's important for people to know this in case they don't know it. What he's saying is that he discovered that humans use a large part of their thinking power to find their way around their complicated social world. Why is my boss looking so funny? Things like that. Was the waitress really flirting with me, or is she being friendly? And so we have this thing called a social brain, which checks facts from time to time. But the much more important aspect to it is the question, social consequences. If I do or say this, what happens, right? So he says, we have a mechanism in our heads that even prevents us from thinking what is right when in doubt, if it jeopardizes our social status in return. This phenomenon is all the more pronounced the higher a person's social and economic status of a person is. The educated and or wealthy people are more concerned about what others might think of their opinions because they have a lot to lose, obviously, a lot of money to lose, academic standing. He goes on to say, the more educated and smarter a person is, the more skillful his brain is at selling him the biggest nonsense as sensible, as long as it raises his social status, right? He goes on to say, the American data analyst David Shore determined that educated people support ideologically more extreme views than people from the working class. So cab drivers, cleaning ladies, tradesmen, and warehouse workers are often much more grounded in reality and have more common sense than professors, teachers, and senior civil servants. The ideological follower, therefore, sits less at the regulars' table and more at the lecture hall. I mean, that's a very important thing to know, right? Because a lot of people put a lot of stake on intellectualism, and they put a lot of they give a lot of credibility to appearance of intellectualism, appearance of someone who's saying something that is meaningful, because they don't understand it. And if they don't understand it, that means they must be important because they're above them, social standing, right?
I can't even tell you, Frank, how many times I've experienced this in kind of the high snobiety circles where you go, there's a topic of conversation and everybody chimes in on the same wavelength, and everybody seems to know deep down it's complete bullshit. Like this is complete bullshit, but because you believe it and you're so convinced that this is the truth, let's just pretend that this fake reality that we're discussing is actually truth, so nobody loses face. And it's like, holy shit, I could never participate in this madness, like, because you're entering mad land. But it explains why you have all these forums and international discussions and people getting together and spending billions of dollars on events discussing fake realities.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, how much have we seen of that in the last 3 or 4 years? So like total, complete fake pitches, fake premises put out there and sold to us under the garb of doctors and, intellectuals and our higher ups telling us we must do that.
But oftentimes, correct me if I'm wrong, oftentimes behind the scenes, behind closed doors, the same person that just pitched that in front of their esteemed colleagues will tell you, well, actually data shows that this really isn't true, but this is the narrative. What can I do?
Exactly. This is the sad part of the reality, the fake timeline, that this is how you identify. For example, these are like, the reason we're doing this here is so that we can help to identify when we see something which is fake, because a lot of people have that question. How can I tell if I'm being lied to, right? So this is kind of one of the sub themes of our talk today, right? So, okay, let's move forward into his first next soundbite, which talks about something he wants to warn us about. I think it's very interesting.
It feels like you're trying to warn us about something, multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
If my estimation there is correct, what is the warning?
Much of what we take to be real is fictions. And the reason that fictions are so central in human history is because we control the planet, and rather than the chimpanzees or the elephants or any of the other animals, not because of some kind of individual genius that each of us has, but because we can cooperate much better than any other animal. We can cooperate in much larger numbers and also much more flexibly. And the reason we can do that is because we can create and believe in fictional stories. And we are manipulated by all these fictions, by all these stories. Again, stories are not bad. They are tools. As long as we use them to cooperate and to help each other, that's wonderful. People think that humans fight over the same things that wolves or chimpanzees fight about, that we fight about territory, that we fight about food. It sometimes happens, but most wars in history were not really about territory or food. But people have different mythologies, different stories in their minds, and they can't find a common story they can agree about. And this is at the root of most human conflicts. And being able to tell the difference between what is a fiction in our own mind and what is the reality, this is a crucial skill.
You deserve the truth, but big tech does not want you to hear it. So we built our own Inspired platform on the inspiredchannel.com. To watch the full video and more, just click the link in the video description or the pinned comment.